They told us Africa was fighting terrorism, but they never explained why the war never ends and who benefits from the delay. For more than a decade, the Sahel has been painted as a battlefield without a future. Headlines speak of chaos, extremism, and endless instability. Yet beneath the noise lies a quieter question, one rarely asked aloud. How can a land so rich remain so permanently under siege? If this is only a security crisis, why does peace feel so inconvenient to those who claim to manage it? On a January evening in 2026, inside the Kuluba Palace in Ouagadougou, that question stopped being abstract. In front of national and international journalists, a young captain, now head of state, did not offer slogans. He offered a diagnosis, not of terrorism alone, but of a system where wars are maintained, resources extracted, and sovereignty postponed under polite diplomatic language. This was not a speech about one country. It was a mirror held up to an entire continent. A warning that aid can become a leash, that security can become a business, and that dependence often hides behind the vocabulary of partnership. Stay with us. This is more than an interview. It is a line being drawn. Subscribe and witness how one nation dares to ask the question others avoid. Because if one small landlocked country begins to refuse the script, what does that mean for the rest of Africa? The setting was formal, almost ritualistic. 10 journalists, 5 themes, 90 minutes inside the Kuluba Palace in Ouagadougou on Saturday, January 17, 2026. Yet what unfolded was not a routine press exercise. It was a reframing of a war the world thought it already understood. Security and defense came first, as they always do in the Sahel. The question was predictable, sharpened by time. At the very beginning of his tenure, the president had said that if everything were put in place, 3 months might be enough to move toward the end of the war. 3 years later, critics argued, the war was still there. How did he respond? The answer did not deny the gap. It explained it. If everything had been put in place, he repeated, that condition mattered. Because when power changed hands, what the new authorities encountered was not a nation ready for war, but a structure built for delay. The first obstacle, he said, was not the enemy in the field. It was resistance to change at the political level. Almost immediately, actors approached the new leadership with proposals that came wrapped in urgency, but bound by conditions. Support was offered in ways that ensured the conflict would continue, not conclude. The implication was stark. Some wars are not meant to end. Traoré described heated exchanges with foreign diplomats over strategy and timing. The message he claimed to have received was subtle but unmistakable. Ending the war quickly was not aligned with certain external agendas. Accepting assistance meant accepting contradictions, support for counterterrorism on paper, tolerance of destabilizing forces in practice. Faced with that reality, the leadership made a decision that would redraw the security landscape, to remove all foreign forces present on national soil and accept the consequences that would follow. What followed, he said, was the real struggle. Then came the inventory. When the new authorities assessed the state of the armed forces, the picture was not merely alarming, it was paralyzing. Across the entire country, there were fewer than 100,000 rounds of Kalashnikov ammunition. In terms of weapons, barely 100 were available. Soldiers had been deployed with courage, but without means. Some, he stated, had stood on the front line without weapons at all. How do you wage a war like that? He asked, not rhetorically but structurally. The army had not been prepared for combat, neither in equipment nor in manpower. Whatever optimism existed around a 3-month timeline collapsed under that reality. The soil had been neglected. The seed had never been planted. Rebuilding began at the most basic level. First, equipping the personnel already in uniform. That alone proved difficult. Many powerful states refused to sell arms. Others delayed or restricted deliveries. Procurement became a test of endurance and diplomacy. Eventually, the country turned to partners willing to sell without lectures. Weapons arrived gradually. Support equipment followed. The process was slow, unfinished and costly, but it moved forward. Recruitment accelerated. Each year, between 10,000 and 15,000 new personnel were brought in. The effort was framed as existential. Adversity, he argued, was increasing, not decreasing. Armed groups were expanding, reinforced by mercenaries drawn into the conflict from outside the country. The threat was evolving and adaptation became constant. By the 3rd year, the strategy shifted again. No longer only buying weapons, manufacturing them. This, Traoré said, was not ambition, it was necessity. No bank would finance sovereignty. No loan would build a defense industry. Equipment for such factories would not be sold freely. The only option was internal mobilization, Skills, resources, and patience. Intellectual capacity existed. What had been missing was the decision to activate it. Morale against expectations rose alongside pressure. Discipline tightened. Units that failed were dissolved. Commanders who did not deliver were dismissed and in some cases prosecuted. The mission, he insisted, was sacred. Determination mattered more than numbers. Asked whether soldiers would prefer foreign forces to fight in their place, he claimed the answer was no. They would rather die. That mindset, he argued, was the true turning point. The war, he concluded, was no longer being fought blindly. The army had learned where the threat came from, how it adapted, and why it persisted. Soon, he said, observers would speak of a black albino appearing, a phrase left unexplained, hanging in the air like a marker of something yet to be revealed. Wars do not end, he implied, when timelines are announced. They end when conditions are created, and when a nation accepts the cost of creating them alone. But if the battlefield is only the surface, and the deeper struggle is over resources, influence, and who controls the pace of peace, then the war Burkina Faso is fighting may not be the one most people think it is. The war did not answer with silence. It answered with pressure. As the interview moved deeper, the language shifted. The discussion was no longer about timelines or inventories. It was about endurance. What happens after the doors close, after foreign flags are lowered, after the safety nets disappear? This was where the tone hardened, where the war spoke back. The first surge came from the ground. Traoré described an army forced to adapt in real time. Equipment arrived but never fast enough. Training expanded, but the threat evolved faster. Armed groups multiplied, not shrank. According to his account, recruitment on the opposing side intensified, fueled by mercenaries drawn into the Sahel's expanding conflict economy. In response, the armed forces shifted doctrine. Adaptation became constant. Units learned to operate with scarcity, to improvise under pressure, to fight without the illusion of overwhelming superiority. Resilience, he argued, became the defining trait. Burkina Faso, he said, was facing a level of pressure few countries on earth could withstand. Military, economic, diplomatic, and informational at once. Then came the second crest of the wave, morale. Determination, he insisted, was the decisive weapon. Not equipment, not alliances, determination. Within the ranks, a new standard was imposed. Commanders who failed to accomplish their missions were removed. Some were prosecuted. Failure was no longer explained away. It was sanctioned. The mission, he said, was sacred. To wear the uniform meant accepting that standard without negotiation. Asked directly about the morale of troops on the front lines, his answer was uncompromising. If a Burkinabe soldier were asked whether he wanted others to come and fight in his place, the response would not be yes. It would be refusal. They would rather die. That mindset, Traoré argued, was proof that something fundamental had shifted. The soldiers now understood why they were fighting, who they were fighting, and what was at stake if they lost. This was not presented as romantic sacrifice. It was framed as clarity. But the war was not only kinetic, it was psychological. At this point, the conversation turned to fear, or rather its absence. The president acknowledged the scale of the threat. Coup attempts had been foiled. Pressure came from within and without. History weighed heavily. Names were invoked. Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara. Leaders eliminated not only by external forces, but by internal fractures carefully exploited. Was he afraid? His response was simple. No. Not because danger did not exist, but because fear paralyzes purpose. If you hesitate, he said, you compromise. And once compromise sets in, you are finished. Trust, in the people, in the mission, and in clarity of purpose, was presented as the antidote. This clarity extended into training. One of the most consequential decisions, he argued, was to take control of military education. Foreign-trained forces, he warned, carry foreign doctrines. When others train your army, they shape not only skills, but loyalties and reflexes. To prevent infiltration and manipulation, Burkina Faso built its own institutions. Higher military schools, internal training programs, and units forged from local experience. He claimed to have personally taken part in early training phases. That, he said, was precisely what disturbed external powers most. They could no longer read the army. They could no longer predict its doctrine. Units trained in Burkina Faso, by Burkinabe, for Burkinabe objectives, removed an old advantage from those accustomed to influence through instruction. As the exchange intensified, the discussion widened beyond borders. Encirclement was raised, not as paranoia but as pattern. Military deployments in neighboring countries, new camps near borders, diplomatic friction wrapped in security language. Traoré did not deny it. He normalized it. Revolutions, he said, generate resistance. Encirclement is logical. Adversity is expected. The question, he insisted, was not how to avoid it, but how to render it meaningless. A state without a strong army, he argued, is not a state at all. For decades, African countries were told not to militarize, to rely on others for protection, to accept vulnerability as maturity. The result, he said, was chaos when crises emerged. Burkina Faso chose a different path, to fight on its own soil, to train on its own soil, and to accept the cost of sovereignty up front rather than indefinitely deferred. Then, without warning, came a sentence that broke the rhythm. Soon, he said, people would speak of a black albino appearing. No explanation followed, no metaphor unpacked. The phrase hung suspended, cryptic, deliberate, unsettling. The war, he insisted, would end, not someday, soon, but only because the nature of the struggle had been understood. If the fiercest battles are no longer fought only with bullets, but with doctrine, discipline, and control over who trains whom, then the next front may not be in the desert, but in the institutions that shape power itself. War does not stop at the front line. It travels into offices, classrooms, markets, and mines. As the interview moved away from uniforms and weapons, the consequences of the conflict revealed themselves in quieter, more intrusive ways. What was at stake, Traoré argued, was not only territorial control, but the very architecture of everyday life. A war prolonged by dependency corrodes institutions. A war fought for sovereignty forces them to change. The first battlefield was governance. When the new authorities took charge, they did not encounter a clean system weakened by crisis. They encountered what he described as a knot, one problem untied only to reveal another beneath it. Corruption was not an exception, it was routine. Public procurement, financial management, and service delivery operated on habits formed over decades. Contracts were inflated, payments circulated in cash. Transparency was resisted not because it was impossible, but because it was threatening. The response was blunt. Leaders would lead by example, or not at all. Traoré rejected a political culture in which those in power lived in abundance, while others drowned fetching water or slept without food. That contrast, he said, was not unfortunate. It was unacceptable. A society at war could not afford moral incoherence. Digitization became a tool of discipline. Electronic invoicing, cashless procedures, traceable payments. These were not presented as technical reforms, but as acts of defense. When money stops circulating invisibly, power shifts. Resistance followed immediately. Large operators opposed the changes. Habits hardened. But the direction did not change. The logic was simple. A state that cannot control its own finances cannot control its own future. Agriculture revealed the same pattern. For years, farmers were described as unproductive. The land was blamed. Yet when initiatives reached the countryside, tools, access, organization, the story shifted. Production rose, families fed themselves, surpluses entered local markets. Village elders managed reserves, releasing them at subsidized prices during shortages. Food security, Traoré suggested, was not charity, it was structure. The war had forced a reordering of priorities. Public funds were redirected, entire sectors were reviewed. State-owned enterprises that had long drained resources were audited and restructured. In hydrocarbons, subsidies were eliminated, debts were cleared, profits appeared. Where money had once leaked, it was now captured. But the most sensitive transformation was social. Revolution, as he defined it, was not a slogan. It was a behavioral rupture. Politics, as it had been practiced, clientelism, flattery, deception, had no place in it. Those who clung to old methods were excluded. Those who adapted were integrated, regardless of past affiliation. Unity, not purity, was the objective. But discipline was non-negotiable. Education became a front line. Children, he argued, were the real target. Not young adults, but the youngest citizens whose habits were still forming. Civic education, patriotism, and responsibility were to be introduced early. Youth immersion programs were designed not to punish, but to expose. Students accustomed to comfort slept on mats, ate what was available, and experienced scarcity by design. Hunger was not theatrical, it was instructive. The message was not humiliation, it was awareness. A generation raised without understanding inequality, he warned, would reproduce it instinctively. But a generation that felt it, briefly, deliberately, might govern differently when given responsibility. These changes did not come without friction. Accusations emerged, narratives spread, images circulated, especially around contested security operations. Traoré cited the case of civilians allegedly killed in Solenzo, arguing that misinformation was weaponized to fracture cohesion. According to his account, civilians were later presented publicly in safety. The war, he insisted, had an informational front. Silence was sometimes strategic. Truth, when revealed, was meant to speak louder than reaction. Unions too were drawn into the reckoning. Dialogue resumed, but on altered terms. Imported models of confrontation, he argued, served external interests more than national ones. Social demands were legitimate. Manipulation was not. Files existed. Histories were known. The state would listen, but it would not bargain under threat while the country was at war. Throughout this transformation, the figure at the center remained explicit about responsibility. This was not governance by consensus alone. It was governance by decision. Order and discipline, he repeated, were prerequisites for development. Without them, no amount of aid, partnership, or goodwill could substitute. At this point, the interview crossed from policy into philosophy. The revolution was not only against terrorism or corruption or dependency, it was against inertia, against the idea that things could not change because they never had. In that sense, the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré was presented not as exceptional, but as symptomatic, an expression of pressures building beneath the surface of Burkinabe society for decades. The war had entered daily life, and daily life, reshaped by necessity, was beginning to fight back. Yet when a country tightens its systems, reclaims discipline, and redraws the rules of power at home, how long before the outside world responds, not with concern, but with resistance? No revolution exists in isolation. The moment a nation redraws its internal rules, the external map reacts. As the interview widened its lens, the conversation shifted from domestic reform to international friction. What had begun as a struggle for security and discipline at home now revealed itself as a geopolitical fault line. The question was no longer whether Burkina Faso could endure pressure, but how much pressure would follow a refusal to conform. The alliance of Sahel states was presented as the first answer. Not a treaty drafted in distant conference rooms, but a confederation born of shared threat. Mali, Niger, and their partners were described not as satellites of a central authority, but as states coordinating by necessity. Joint operations, shared intelligence, a command structure designed to respond faster than diplomacy ever could. According to Traoré, this alliance belonged not to leaders, but to populations who had embraced it as protection rather than posture. Encirclement, however, remained a reality. Military deployments in neighboring countries, new camps near contested borders, training missions announced under familiar humanitarian language. Traoré did not deny the pattern, he contextualized it. Revolutions provoke containment. Those who refuse to play assigned roles are surrounded, not confronted openly. The objective, he argued, is not invasion, but exhaustion. Regional institutions entered the frame next. Relations with ECOWAS were described as broken not by misunderstanding, but by divergence. When Burkina Faso, alongside Mali and Niger, announced its departure, it was framed as a response to an organization perceived to prioritize procedure over people. Sanctions, suspensions, and silence were interpreted not as neutral enforcement, but as political signaling. Whether departure would be immediate or procedural mattered less, he suggested, than the principle behind it. Sovereignty could not be conditional. The African Union was treated with more restraint, but no less frustration. Suspension without dialogue. Mediation promised but delayed. A silence that raised a sharper question than confrontation ever could. What purpose does an institution serve if it disappears when pressure is applied? Traoré stopped short of announcing withdrawal. Instead, he framed patience as respect. Respect for process, and for the need to explain decisions to one's own people before making them irreversible. Then came the global powers. The United States appeared in the discussion not as a single actor, but as a system of doctrines, incentives, and red lines. Warnings against militarization, economic tools framed as encouragement, diplomatic language that suggested concern while imposing consequence, trade privileges withdrawn, partnerships recalibrated. The message, as interpreted by Traoré, was familiar. Alignment is rewarded, deviation is disciplined. Yet the response was not defiance for its own sake. It was recalibration. Relations were not severed, they were reassessed. Cooperation was no longer automatic. Interests were weighed openly. Elsewhere, new vectors emerged. Russia, China, Iran, named not as saviors but as alternatives. Technology transfer replaced assistance. Training replaced donation. Scholarships replaced speeches. The principle remained consistent. Learn how to fish or remain permanently dependent on those who sell the catch. In this widening arena, Burkina Faso was no longer merely defending territory. It was contesting narratives about development, legitimacy, and who gets to define responsibility in Africa. The international system, long accustomed to predictability, now faced an unfamiliar variable, a state that accepted isolation as a temporary cost rather than a permanent threat. If pressure is the language of power, and resistance its unintended consequence, then the final question is not who surrounds the revolution, but whether the revolution can outlast the circle. The future does not arrive by declaration. It is constructed, step by step, often under fire. As the interview drew toward its later stages, the tone shifted once more. No longer diagnostic, no longer defensive, it became forward-looking. The question was not whether the struggle would continue, but what kind of country would emerge if it did. Traoré framed the road ahead around three inseparable pillars: security, production, and dignity. Remove one, and the structure collapses. Security remained the foundation, not as an abstract ideal, but as control of land. Fields reclaimed, roads reopened, valleys secured. He spoke of territories once serving as logistical reservoirs for armed groups, now retaken and reintegrated. These were not described as symbolic victories, but as economic ones. Land freed from violence could feed families again. Routes cleared of ambush could carry goods instead of fear. But security alone, he insisted, only buys time. The second pillar was production. Not extraction, but transformation. Gold that leaves us ore leaves value behind. Crops exported raw export jobs with them. The future he outlined demanded factories, not warehouses, skills, not shortcuts. This was why the state moved into areas long left to speculation: roads, energy, processing, sometimes at the expense of private interests unwilling to adapt. Regulation was not hostility, it was correction. Capitalism left unchecked, he warned, optimizes profit at the cost of cohesion. Automation without planning produces unemployment without alternatives. Growth without redistribution deepens fracture. The role of the state, as he defined it, was not to replace initiative but to prevent collapse. Where markets failed to serve the collective, intervention was justified. Not temporarily but strategically. Education was woven through every projection. Curricula would change. Models would be questioned. Why, he asked, should a country import a single theory of economics as if it was scripture? Systems were created by humans for contexts. Burkina Faso would create its own, hybrid, pragmatic, rooted in reality rather than ideology. Universities were no longer meant to reproduce dependency, but to design solutions. Women, he argued, were central to this transformation, not as beneficiaries of aid, but as engines of production. Small-scale processing, cooperatives, guaranteed markets. From soap to cooking oil, from grain to packaging, value creation began at the neighborhood level. Support meant contracts, not charity. Demand, not pity. Throughout these projections, one risk remained unavoidable: isolation. Choosing sovereignty invited retaliation, trade barriers, diplomatic coldness. Media narratives sharpened into caricature. But Traoré rejected the idea that integration required submission. Partnership, he said, must be voluntary, or it is dependency by another name. The objective was not to sever ties, but to rebalance them. The final horizon he described was neither utopian nor immediate. It was patient. Factories take time. Armies mature through experience. Institutions harden through discipline. Sacrifice, he acknowledged, was unavoidable. But sacrifice with direction differed from suffering without end. The road ahead was not guaranteed. Failure was possible. Pressure would intensify. But waiting for permission, for rescue, for approval, was no longer an option. History, he implied, does not reward those who hesitate at the edge of choice. If sovereignty demands endurance before reward, and sacrifice before harvest, then the question is no longer whether the path is hard, but whether turning back is still imaginable. History rarely announces its turning points in advance. They arrive quietly, through choices made under pressure, through patience forged in uncertainty, through a refusal to accept the limits others assign. What unfolded in this long, unfiltered conversation was not a manifesto of certainty. It was an argument for responsibility, an insistence that sovereignty is not a gift delivered by allies, nor a slogan printed on banners, but a process built through discipline, production, and endurance. It demands costs before it yields returns, and it tests resolve long before it rewards belief. At the center of this story stands Ibrahim Traoré, not as a myth, but as a symptom of deeper currents moving through African societies. Currents shaped by fatigue with dependency, by frustration at managed instability, and by a growing conviction that dignity cannot be outsourced. Whether one agrees with every method or not, the question he forces into the open cannot be avoided. Who decides when a nation is ready to stand on its own? The answer offered here is unsettling precisely because it is ordinary. Not charity but production, not permission but preparation, not waiting but choosing. Fields must be secured before they can be harvested. Hands must be trained before they can build. Institutions must be disciplined before they can protect the many rather than serve the few. For Burkina Faso, the road ahead remains steep. Pressure will not disappear. Errors will be made. Isolation may deepen before balance is restored. Yet there is a difference between hardship imposed and hardship accepted. One erodes, the other forges. This is why the conversation matters beyond one country, because it reframes the debate from whether Africa should be sovereign to how much it is willing to pay for it. It challenges comfortable narratives that present dependence as stability and intervention as benevolence. And it dares to suggest that the greatest risk may not lie in change, but in remaining permanently managed. The harvest promised here is not immediate. Seeds take time, roads take labor, factories take patience. But history shows that when nations choose to invest in their own hands, their own minds, and their own future, the returns, though delayed, are real. The final question is not whether this path will succeed. It is whether the courage to attempt it will spread. If this story resonates with your sense of justice and responsibility, stay with it, share it, question it, and take part in the conversation, because the future of sovereignty will not be written by spectators.